Well, good afternoon, everybody, and you're very welcome. And thank you for joining us. My name is John Copps. I'm from Mutual Ventures, and I'm very much looking forward to today's discussion. Get Britain Working is the government's call to action to address unemployment and a range of underlying issues in the labour market, including around the quality of work. So we're here today to discuss the idea of good work, what that means in practice, and what you can do to promote it. This webinar is part of the WorkWell Programme, a national programme funded by DWP and DHSC to support people off work sick or who have recently left employment in 15 pilot areas in England. WorkWell aims to help 59,000 people that have health-related conditions to get the support they need to stay in or return to work. And so welcome to all colleagues joining from the programme and to others from outside. So we know that not all work is equal. Good work pays a fair income. It includes a reasonable degree of flexibility. It provides security and it has safe working conditions. So we're going to look at what good work means in practice and approaches to encouraging and promoting good work in your local areas. And I'm delighted to be joined by three expert guests from a policy and practice background to discuss good work and what we can do in practice. So let me turn to our panelists who will introduce themselves. Good afternoon, Rosie.
Hi. So I'm Rosie Fogden, and I'm Deputy Director of the Growth and Reform Network, formerly Director of Research at the Centre for Progressive Policy. And we're a network-focused think tank. We work with kind of local, regional, national government across the country on fostering inclusive growth and public service reform. And good work's been a topic that we have kind of engaged with members lots on over the past 4 or 5 years and done quite a lot of research on as well.
Welcome. And hello, Michael.
Hi, John. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name's Michael Wood. I work for the NHS Confederation, which is a membership body for a range of different NHS organisations. And my special interest is anything that links health with the local economy. And this is an issue which firmly fits in that space, John, particularly at the current moment with it raising up the political agenda.
Well, great to have you too, Michael. And hi, Alice.
Hi everyone, my name's Alice Walker. I'm a public health consultant and I work at the Greater London Authority in the Public Health Unit. So we support different parts of the GLA to implement a health and all policies approach. So obviously the Mayor has powers over the economy. So thinking about how we can capitalise on those levers to improve health outcomes and reduce inequalities in London.
Welcome to you all. And so together we'll have a discussion, share some ideas, but we'd also really like to hear from you in the audience. So you can use the on-screen Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions you have, and leave your name if you wish, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. We'll also send you a link to a copy of the recording of this webinar afterwards. So straight into the discussion then, and a question to our panelists. For you then, what are the key issues in good work that we should be discussing today? And Michael, do you want to start us off?
I can, Joe. Yes, I work for the NHS, so I'll start from that space of working for a pretty huge organisation and one which obviously has a natural interest and a role in improving population health, which, you know, this instinctively fits in, John, which is one of the reasons why we've been thinking about our role in that over the recent times. But also, of course, we're not just the biggest employer in every local economy, we're a huge employer at every level, every socio-economic level. So there's something about the issue of population health, but there's also something about what we ourselves can do and what our responsibility is in that. And I think if I was just to pick up just on 2 other issues which relate to that, is actually the more the NHS thinks about this, I think the more the NHS thinks about our partners. So we've got, I was with local government colleagues this week, and it was fascinating hearing about the role of local authorities in trying to develop that fairer, more prosperous economy. And actually, what is the role of the NHS? I hope we get into this, John. What's the role of the NHS actually in helping maintain those almost rules of doing business here, if we want to drive this issue? And so I think the more we think about this from the NHS, John, the more we're drawn into what our partners are thinking, our role in that. And my last point is the policy and the funding. I think this area and this discussion probably will take us into lots of different areas where we talk about policy and funding, John. So looking forward to the next hour.
I'm sure it will. And partners, I guess you can include supply chain there as well. How that can promote good work. Alice, how about you? What from a sort of GLA perspective, from a public health perspective, what are the key things?
I suppose from a public health perspective, it's thinking about the potential of good work to improve health outcomes and reduce inequalities at a population level. So that's kind of from a public health background. But then I suppose from a GLA perspective, it's what can regional authorities, what role can they play in terms of increasing access to good work? And I'm sure we'll come on to that some kind of stuff later, but it's this thing of thinking about the different roles that everyone in the system can play with a shared objective.
Yeah, great. And Rosie?
Yeah, so I suppose we're primarily interested in kind of inclusive growth, so take a bit of an economy-wide perspective. So, you know, the relationship, as Michael was saying, between work and health it's a central issue to inclusive growth. People can only contribute to growth to the economy when they're well enough to do so. And, you know, being in good quality work, we know that's positive for people's health and well-being. On the other hand, you know, there's a body of evidence which suggests poor quality work is bad for health and productivity. So suppose we're sort of interested in the productivity angle, but also, as Alice was saying, I think, how do this government and regional and local governments actually do something about this now? And I think the key thing will be the kind of talking about the ways in which all those different together on this, because it's not an area where any one tier of government has got like all of the levers to pull. So how can we work across the system to kind of actually move this agenda forward?
Great. Well, we've got some really good topics there. I'm sure we can get back to. So this is there's quite a thorny issue behind all this, I think. And I've got a question that perhaps each of you could respond to, just that I think reaches into that, which is any work better than no work? Michael, do you want to start with that?
I think what I'd say, John, is the similarities between low quality work and unemployment. Absolutely, and certainly in terms of people's health, but also, you know, it's bad for the individual, it's bad for business, it's bad for our economy, as we've heard, it's bad for the wider public interest too. So there's something about it's not quite a binary world we're talking about here. And actually, what are the challenges of understanding different populations and how we should be supporting them, and the relationship between work and people's health? It is going to involve all of us working together to try and understand it. So I think there's something about moving away from that binary nature of it to working out some of this, you know, some of that similarities, and then working out what we can do about it, which I'm sure is where this conversation will take us.
Mm-hmm. Rosie, is any work better than
so
work?
I think, I mean, at an individual level, I mean, obviously, like the answer is it depends. It's going to depend on the specifics of the job, people's personal and like financial situations to some extent. So, you know, at an individual level, that's not really something I don't think we can answer definitively. I think taking that economy-wide perspective, it's quite clear that poor quality work isn't conducive to productivity growth, because, you know, we've got kind of 2022 JRF research suggests that we've got 2/3 of working age adults in poverty, in work poverty, so low pay and poor quality jobs, increased demands for benefits and public services. Also, the kind of stresses associated with economic insecurity is going to negatively impact health. That also increases demand on our public services. And on top of that, you've got the point that cheap labour kind of deters investment in the capital, which is going to make us more productive as a nation as a whole. I think it was the IPPR who found that the UK had been in the bottom of the G7 for investment in the 24 of the last 30 years or something like that. So overall, as a country, if we want to grow together, it's poor quality work isn't a growth strategy. And so I think from a kind of policy perspective, to some extent, the ins and outs of any work versus no work, we should be promoting good quality work across the system, because that's what's going to help us.
That's interesting. So there's strong macroeconomic arguments for good work. Yeah.
Yes, and I think from a kind of perspective of people actually feeling growth in places across the country, which is so important at the moment for connecting kind of the current government's missions and the mission of growth to people's actual everyday experience, cost of living.
Yeah, that's great. And Alice, I know you come at this from a sort of health disparity, public health point of view. So what about your response to, is any work better than no work?
I mean, I'd echo much of what has already been said. I suppose just to kind of emphasize the point that bad work can be quite toxic in terms of both physical and mental health, cardiovascular strain, mental health outcomes, impact on wider social outcomes of a family. So to kind of, yeah, obviously at the individual level, it's very, very hard to say whether or not, because you wouldn't want to, you know, it depends on people's individual priorities and needs. But I would also add, on a kind of societal level, once someone falls out of the workforce or doesn't have the right support to stay in the workforce, it's very difficult to support them to get back in. It's very difficult in terms of expense and time, and the evidence suggests that it just costs a lot more money and it's a lot more effortful in terms of delivering programs. So there is a long-term cost to having work that is not going to support people to stay in the workplace.
Yeah. That's so let's turn to the actual question of good work. And Rosie, do we have an agreed definition of it? Is it or how close are we to that?
There are plenty of, you know, in the policy world, we're never short of definitions of things. So I suppose the baseline that we've often returned to is the Taylor Review of Good Work, which was back in 2017, picked up by the 2018 Good Work Plan, the government. That kind of had these 6 dimensions of good work, which are pay and benefits, terms of employment, training and progression, working conditions, voice and representation. So that's something that we've referred back to. But I mean, we've also much more recently than that. Last year, we did a piece of research that looked into good work in places that are both deprived and have low levels of social infrastructure. So kind of community centres, transport links, that kind of thing. And we did quite a lot of focus groups and interviews on good work, and a lot of that was picking apart what people thought that was, and from talking to people in those kind of places, they conceptualize good work as a bit of a kind of hierarchy of needs, and at the base of that is secure jobs, being paid a living wage, and that's kind of, people conceptualize that as the foundation on which other things like fairness, opportunities for progression, fulfillment were based. So I think, so that is actually, in some ways, that kind of reinforces the Taylor Review buckets to some extent. But I think it's quite, or one, it comes from talking to people who maybe have some experience of poor quality work. But I think that also is quite intuitive as a description as well.
So those 2 things at the base, though, reasonable living wage and stability, to a large extent, central government can use levers to influence those, can't they? So what about the meaning of good work in different parts of the country and to different people beyond that? Is that, how various is that?
Well, I think to some extent it's always like how people see kind of what they want out of a job in terms of opportunity, progression, values, fairness is always going to vary to some degree, but that doesn't mean that you can't put in kind of uniform good practice on that front. People don't have to all want the same job. You know, you could still have standardized good practice that varies across different sectors.
Yeah, Michael, do you have any thoughts on the on that sort of issue of what good work is, particularly from the NHS point of view?
I mean, I must say, Matthew Taylor's my current chief executive, John, so I will absolutely fly a flag for Matthew's report. I know it was done in a different guise. But it's interesting on that last point Rosie made. I think in the report, he spoke about people holding the same job with contradictory views of whether actually that was in their eyes a good work. So there's something interesting there. I also really interesting, if you think 7 or 8 years ago, I think it was, wasn't it, Rosie mentioned that Taylor Review. And actually, if you think about how much of it still stands now, and it still stands the test of time, John. But if Matthew was to go back and revisit this issue now, knowing what we knew then, I'm sure there'd be some great practice would be in there, and Alice can talk about some great practice in London. But also, since then, the role of ill health and economic inactivity has absolutely risen up the agenda, hasn't it? So actually, what we're talking about today would probably be much more prominent in what Matthew will be talking about, John. So I think it's really interesting just thinking about the issues, since that report came out and what we've learned and what that's taught us. And certainly the NHS now is much more familiar with it. We can talk about some NHS good practice and maybe some challenges the NHS has as we go through, John. But Matthew's report is still there. What's new? What have we learned? What are the issues which should guide us in the next 12 months?
Interesting. And so, Alice, from your point of view, then, so the definition of good work in London, do you think that's different to the definition of good work in, let's say, a rural county?
I think the definition of good work as we have it is kind of outcomes based. So when we have an outcomes-based definition, different people will have different needs and requirements to reach that outcome. So even taking an example like wages, obviously the London living wage is different from the living wage in other parts of the country. So that's a very kind of clear example of where the same output needs a different implementation measure to achieve the same thing for different people. The same thing with people with childcare needs or various things of flexible working. What constitutes a kind of a good, secure feeling job will be different for different people living in different circumstances. So I think the outcome-based definition is useful, but it does mean that there will be variation across people and contexts as well.
So if we take the sort of aspects of good work we all talked about there, let's talk about promoting it. How do we make it happen? Michael, you're nodding your head.
A really interesting point, and when Alice was talking, a few years ago I set up the NHS London Anchor Network when I was advising NHS London. And what was interesting, we talk about changing cultures. We looked at some of London's work outside the NHS, and we thought, well, hang on a minute, we're a huge employer within the capital. What can we learn from other sectors, and what can we try and incentivize, but what can we bring in? And there was a huge push around London living wage. And I think we doubled or trebled the number of NHS trusts in London paying that. And we started trying to echo some of those thoughts and change that culture whilst learning from others, actually. So it's testament to the work Alice and others have done in London that it was directly influencing what we did in the NHS. We're very conscious in the NHS, we are a direct employer. So we have the ability to try and make more immediate changes than perhaps some other employers have, not only actually some other public service employers who cannot make those direct decisions. So that was certainly something we tried doing in London. We were successful. Of course, this isn't just a one-off decision. You've got to keep understanding the context and what, for example, the living wage is, and keep being committed to that and showing your commitment to that and showing your commitment in different ways, John. So that's an ongoing conversation, but we started there and we will continue it as long as we work in close partnership. And we understand the benefits of doing this for our own staff, but also how that affects and supports other parts of the public sector and other parts of our families and our different staff. We have a duty of care to our staff, but the NHS in many up and down the country doesn't just support individuals, we support households. And I think we're still learning the extent to which we have that impact, John, and that sense of duty, around on our wards, but when people go home too. And I think we feel that increasingly we feel that, and we're trying to understand what our response is to that.
Can you develop the idea of around the Anchor Network a bit more? Like, how can that be a tool or a forum for building this? Just, I suppose, beyond just the NHS providers.
I think, first of all, a recognition that you have inherent economic and social agency. So the NHS, if I'm being brutally honest, is quite late to the party on this. We've often seen ourselves as a service provider, which of course is incredibly important, but by simply being there, through thick and thin, supporting the fluctuating economic needs of a place, we need to do that intentionally. And so we're trying to do that across the NHS, but you are best doing that with the collection of other anchors in a place. So, in London, there's a fantastic London Anchor Institutions Network, which brings the NHS alongside universities, GLA Group, local boroughs, business, faith leaders. And actually, it's that understanding that the NHS's challenges in London are the same as London's civic challenges. And actually, we play a part in that. But, I was in Leeds yesterday, a fantastic anchor network in Leeds. There's some great stuff happening in the West Midlands. I think it's just becoming more part of our vocabulary, John.
Yeah.
And the more you understand those links that we set out at the start, you realise it's not just our services which make people healthy, which actually address our demand, which support our workforce, which support our communities. So we're still on that journey. It's certainly not, certainly not something we've cracked yet. But I would hope if you were to walk into any town up and down the country and say to your NHS leader, explain to me how you show your commitment to communities, they would say, we're an anchor. We know that our job is to be more intentional and try and show how we manifest that.
So it's sort of showing by example and encouraging,
and that's a particular public sector job, isn't it? If us in the public sector are not taking the lead on this, especially when you work for a sector like the NHS, which inherently stand to gain from good work, if we're not taking a lead from this, then how can we expect other sectors? How can we expect small businesses? How can we expect some of our colleagues in the private sector to really play their part? We've got to show that civic leadership. And I feel that strongly, and I'm sure local government as the stewards of place feel that strongly too. It comes back to those rules of doing business I set out at the outset, John.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it was fascinating when you said at the start of this answer that you managed to get all the NHS Trust to pay the living wage. I kind of assumed that they would already. But that kind of shows that there's some progress to make.
Yeah, I think that's something that kind of leading by example anchor is something we've seen for quite a long time in local and regional government, and there's quite a lot of examples of places like Greater Manchester, West of England, Liverpool City region, who've kind of taken on that anchor role within a broader suite of policies. So we've seen all of those places roll out some version of good employment charters. We've seen them all kind of campaigning on the issue of good work, and then also modeling those good employment practices in their own organizations, as well as and then the kind of bridging step really is kind of building health and well-being into the kind of development plans, just so you kind of really round that whole circle. But I think acting as a good employer, modeling good employment practices, I think that's all part of the role, particularly that combined authorities have seen themselves playing in the last few years, that we've kind of seen through our inclusive growth network.
So Rosie mentioned their good employment charters. Alice, I know London has one. Can you say a bit more about that and kind of where you're at with it, what it's achieving? Because I think there'll be colleagues who are listening who will be from some of the bigger cities who may be familiar with that, but others who probably won't.
Yeah, and these exist in several regions, and I guess they are kind of contextually designed. I know that I also will not take credit for anything to do with the Good Work Standard. We advise on the kind of technical health aspects of it, but it's delivered by our economic fairness team. And if any colleagues are interested to kind of learn more directly from them, they're really happy to share their contact details, so I can do that via you after the session. But it was co-designed in 2019 with 250 stakeholders from business and from various other places, so that it was designed in a way that was appropriate for the needs of Londoners. And it really does it's designed according to those 6 outcomes that Rosie shared near the beginning. So thinking about what do employers need to ensure fair pay, engagement, voice and wellbeing, skills and progression, and diversity and inclusive recruitment. So the idea is that employers become accredited once they've proven themselves in relation to those 6 outcomes in various ways. One of which, the most important one, I think, for me as a public health person, is a living wage commitment. So that is a fundamental criteria to be accredited. But there have been a few ways in which the Good Work Standard it was refreshed recently because of the recent changes in legislation. So it is constantly changing to make sure it's in line with current laws. But also there is a new one adapted for micro businesses, so businesses that with fewer than 10 people, because obviously we can't let different employers we can't hold them to the same standard of accreditation. You know, when you're just growing as a business, it's important not to put people off thinking that accreditation is just completely not feasible for them. Rather have something that's more inclusive and then builds in scope for development. And I should also say that another, I think, really important part of the Good Work Standard is the community of practice that is formed because of it. So there's that space then for learning, there's workshops, toolkits, webinars, like collaborative learning, and also peer support, which I think is a really important part of developing employer practice, but also changing the culture more broadly around what good work is and making that the kind of norm rather than something that's different or something that we have to work really hard to achieve. It should just be something that's taken as the needs of an employer to function, really.
That's interesting, those roles. I know Rosie knows quite a bit about these charters around the country. So it sounded like there's sort of three roles there almost. There's almost a campaign. It's a kite mark, if you like, and it's a community that can educate other.
Yeah, I would definitely agree that I think from what we've learned working with our partners, the kind of learning culture around it is one of the key things. So through the network a couple of years ago, we worked with Dr. Sarah Crozier from Manchester Metropolitan University, and she developed a toolkit for designing good work charters based on the experiences of Greater Manchester. So that's actually a resource that's available on our website that we could share, and it's a really kind of comprehensive toolkit. It's a really useful resource, and it kind of, for each of the stages of designing the charter, it highlights some of the kind of challenges and then also, the key considerations for dealing with those. So I think they're difficult things to pull together. And like some of the key things, I guess, are around challenges agreeing the scope and purpose of a charter, like applying it to different sectoral contexts, challenges measuring impact, that can be really tricky. And some of the main things that she really talks about in dealing with those challenges are the importance of, like Alice said, like building partnerships around the charter, promoting case studies and really developing, that reflective learning culture and a community of partners like across the economy, like businesses, local government, anchors, etc., who are working together to kind of try and learn and reiterate, because I don't think it's not a straightforward thing to do or to show impact from necessarily. But it's a valuable process.
And maybe just also to add some of the other ways in which regions can kind of play a role. I think good work charters are important, but also, regional government is also an anchor institution. So through procurement avenues, but making sure procurement is happening through good employers, and also through the adult education budget, thinking about the importance of skill, lack of skills being or skills needs being a barrier to accessing good work, and thinking about how skills programs that regional government has responsibility to deliver can promote accessible skills as well.
Yeah, I think that speaks to the fact that it all needs to be so connected up. Alice, your microphone's a bit crackly, so I don't know if you need to wipe it or turn it on and off again. Rosie, one of the issues I know in WorkWell and other employment programs is engaging employers. And when you're talking about WorkWell, so there's a particular issue is, how do you engage the sort of SMEs? And I don't know if that applies in these good work charters. I can imagine it would do. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I kind of echo what Alice was saying about not making it too high a bar for small businesses, and I would say engaging businesses, including SMEs, as part of the initial discussions, and making sure that when you're designing initiatives, whether it's charters or otherwise, like if those are co-developed with business community, including SMEs, then I think that's going to help you get around some of those problems. So I think bringing in businesses from a really early stage to whatever you're trying to do, and talking to them kind of agreeing some shared purpose. I mean, really, like what we're arguing is that, you know, good work, there's a business reason to promote good work, you know. So I think, you know, when we held our good employment or convened our good employment conference a couple of years ago, businesses who attended were all talking about, you know, the business benefits for productivity, for business success, for the bottom line of good work. And I think there was some research maybe out today by the Living Wage Foundation, which kind of was polling research, which showed that people were more likely to stay in their current job if their employer was to offer a living wage. So I think, you know, there's recruitment and retention benefits, there's staff productivity benefits. This should be something that businesses want to do. So it's about engaging businesses, bringing them in, and not making it seem too difficult, I think, because it should be mutually beneficial.
Yeah. And Michael, so Rosie's kind of just talked about the business case for good work, which I expect is compelling in the NHS because of the links we've talked about with good work and good health. How does, in your experience in the anchor institution conversations, how does that land in the wider local economy?
I mean, first of all, from the NHS perspective, John, I think, you know, we have the NHS staff survey. I think quite frankly, there's often a mixed picture of how staff perceive good work in the NHS. Many positive indicators. I think when I speak to NHS trusts, you know, that they are working hard to try and address the areas where staff feel that we're not quite reaching our optimum. So there's clearly a job we have to do within the NHS. I think what's interesting now, place is much more cognizant in policy terms, isn't it? So it used to be the case when we started that you considered the anchors, the big public sector bodies. And there was that thought at the time that, you know, the private sector might have a tax break offered from across the Pennines and fly across there. Well, if I speak to business now, they are absolutely, they want to be of place. They want to support place. They understand their roots in place. And at the heart of that is they want a healthy, prosperous workforce. And that's one of the biggest barriers they face. So we are seeing now business, and we've got Sir Charlie Mayfield's review happening. I encourage anyone on the call to feed into that and see what Sir Charlie's saying. I think now business are seeing themselves as anchors. And actually that's helping them try and understand what they can do. But again, we've got to partner with them. We've got to help them understand. We've got to we're learning an awful lot. There's a lot of businesses that are providing almost a parallel health service to their own staff. And there's something for me, John, which is interesting, which is where does that go beyond what we provide through simple NHS provision? You know, there's an awful lot of actually we need to understand the challenges business face, what they're doing about it, where we might complement our NHS services with that, where actually we always need to encourage that because that will help keep people healthy and perhaps address demand for us. But is there something we can do to support business in that we haven't actually thought about at the moment? And I think lots of the learning from the programs like WorkWell and others will actually help us, tell us a bit about how our system works, because we have to organise a health and care system which is pretty complex no matter what the geography, and I'm pretty sure we're not as fully connected as we could be, and we need to work out our own role as an employer within that system, and we're still putting those pieces together, I think it's fair to say.
And how much then, with those reflections, how much is this a cultural challenge as much as an economic one for for getting employers on board with the idea of good work?
This wouldn't be the first policy issue on which it's difficult to bring some sectors with you, and if you are a micro employer, that's incredibly challenging. But the impacts on you are even greater, aren't they? They're disproportionately bigger. So I think there's something about I often talk about what you can do at the different levels. So if I'm talking about a system-wide level, might be a combined authority and an integrated care system. Well, actually, who are the other trade representative bodies that we need to talk to try and harmonize those messages? Something like the message and the messenger. You know, the NHS might be a brilliant messenger, but it might not be a brilliant messenger in some ways. We might have the evidence, the clinical evidence for some of that message, but it's up to others who are best placed to tell that. It might be our elected leaders, our mayors and our politicians who are taking a much more proactive role in this. So there is something about, you know, within the NHS family, we have small employers in primary care, you know, and and they are in an incredibly challenging position, you know, in terms of the demands on their care. So how on earth are we supporting our own small businesses that work within the NHS orbits, John, let alone reaching out? And I think there's something about just understanding that we, you know, there are lots of similarities across sectors, you know, and there's lots of advice that we need to link out to. And it's brilliant that I'm sure if you talk to Alice and talk to Greater Manchester, there's many NHS organisations signed up to their Good Work charters. We've got to learn together on this, haven't we? It's not, you know, there isn't an NHS specific focus here over here and a business specific focus over there. Many of the challenges that affect us as individuals are the same. Yeah.
And Rosie, I was just thinking, touched on this point earlier, but supply chains, how much can how much can, you know, if you're an anchor, if you're a big employer or you're a big organization, how much can your sort of power over your supply chain be used to promote good work? Because I think probably everyone here does work for the public sector, or everybody listening as well. And we know some of the requirements you have to do when you're signing up to a grant or a contract.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we have seen like procurement tools used quite broadly. I think they've been, you know, I've not done a full evidence review or anything, but I feel like they've probably been used to varying impact in different places and varying levels of effectiveness. It is definitely important to take, I mean, living wage, as mentioned earlier, is an easy example. Part of living wage accreditation is that you ensure that suppliers, you pay any subcontractors living wage, and there's a clause about suppliers depending on how big you are as an organization, things like that. So I think it is a really important piece of the puzzle. There's a question about how that's best done in public sector organizations, how effective social value in procurement is as it's set out currently. I think those sort of things are up for review, but they're definitely kind of big tools that sit with the public sector and with other big businesses, big anchor organization businesses who want to promote good work, including through their supply chains. I think the supply chain element is really important. But there's also a small business angle to that. You know, what does that mean when you're kind of employing or you've got small businesses in your supply chain, and how does that need to adjust to that circumstance too?
Yeah. Another question on sort of almost the distribution of good work. Is it the case that you're either an employer that offers good work, or you're an employer that doesn't offer good work? Or is it the case that you're an employer that offers both good work and not good work, and you might not even know that you're not offering good work to some of your employees? Because I suppose the reason I'm asking that is that it affects how you would go about encouraging and promoting good work. Anyone got thoughts on that?
Shall I come in first, and then I'm sure Rosie now. So I think there's something it goes back to the start of the conversation where we discussed the different motivations and what people see and perceive as they go through different stages in their career. You could have someone, you know, two people doing the same job at different stages in their career who actually are experiencing very vastly different, you know, stresses and strains and experiences. So you can be good. You can be good and bad. What the point I would make, John, in that is the intentionality. And this comes back to that anchor journey I spoke about. So what was interesting, I spoke to many NHS organizations many years ago, you know, and about how much they knew actually about their role in people's lives. And it was very clear that, You know, it's not about you becoming an anchor. You are an anchor. You matter. You mattered yesterday. You matter today. You matter tomorrow. But they were making decisions for very good clinical reasons, which actually may not have been supporting and improving population health. It may have been actually detrimentally impacting people's health, but they didn't know about it because they had a very narrow focus and it was a very narrow outcome.
Have you got an example of that, Michael?
It could go back to our procurement. It could go back to simply buying things at the cheapest cost price, which actually was, putting local businesses out of business. You know, it was a narrow. You can hit your own targets in any one sector, John, can't you? But you can miss the bigger picture. And I think that intentionality of the impact we have. You know, where are we recruiting from? If we're really recruiting to, improve people's opportunities and lives, that's a very different question to here's 100 vacancies, get the first 100 people in. You know, and I think actually that intentionality suddenly makes you realize, well, how much do we know about the impact we have? What is the potential impact we could have? What are the ways and means we're doing this? You know, and you start unpeeling the onion, don't you, John? And you learn actually a lot about yourself. So what I would say is there's an awful lot of people out there making decisions for the best, for not for bad reasons, but it's quite a narrow focus they have, and perhaps they're not aware of the wider implications.
Yeah. That's interesting because that gets me thinking. There's so much power in the hands of the purchaser, isn't there? And I don't just mean the organization, I mean us. You know, if we decide the types of companies we want to buy products from, and that can be a lever for good work, you know, and I guess some of those standards we've talked about, living wage, would encourage that.
I think I just go on. Sorry, I just want to say that it's good to, because I mean, going back to that kind of hierarchy again, I know that there's in terms of skills and employment support and that kind of thing, you can do a lot more kind of towards the top of the hierarchy, but just at the base level, when we're talking about job security, we're talking about low pay, we're talking about those kind of things. I think it is important to just remember that there are lots of jobs which don't meet that criteria. And yes, there is a kind of national government policy enforcement issue, and there are particular sectors where there's kind of non-compliance is identified as an issue, sectors like agriculture, sectors like construction. But there's also lots of sectors which are kind of on the margins of that. So the kind of social care sector, you've got the early years workforce, so kind of, low paid sectors. I think, there's a lot that local government, regional government can do, I think, on that bottom rung as well. It's not all just for national government. So local government, for example, is a purchaser of social care services for the kind of council area, and so they have power over that, and that can be the kind of basics of security and low pay as well. So I think that all of the conversation is really valuable and useful, but it's not, good work isn't just a kind of ethereal thing that's different for everyone. There is that kind of base level, and actually I think like players across the country in places and businesses can have like a really tangible impact on the basics as well. I think that's worth just reminding everyone.
Yeah, so there's those sectors of the economy, interesting, early years care, probably hospitality, those sorts of
retail as well.
Yeah, okay. And so what about ways of encouraging good work in those sectors specifically, maybe that we haven't talked about? Does anybody have examples?
Just on the supply chain bit, I can speak. So because the NHS supply chain reaches, as you can imagine, into lots of different areas where you might not have thought about it. It's so vast. One thing we've done in London is we've got a social value framework for London, and I think at the last count, I think there's £500 million worth of NHS contracts going through that. And I remember I was flicking through a spreadsheet of the commitments that many of our suppliers had made. And it was fascinating. You've got the usual ones, increased mental health training, anti-slavery training, more apprentices taken on, living wage. But there was some, I'd have to go back, and there was some fantastic ones which took me well outside, the thought of what an NHS purchaser here who sat at my desk could achieve, John. And it does make you think about it. It grows your mind and therefore your ambition, and it grows your understanding of just how many people you touch. So there are definitely some sectors that we link, not directly, but that we touch, which are struggling at the moment, and that actually we have a part to play. And another example I'll give is health on the high street. So I did lots during COVID about moving health services into empty shop fronts. And actually what was interesting at the time was the business community were slightly, I don't want to say there's a stigma around health services, but perhaps we weren't their traditional next door neighbor. Well, we were the only ones bringing footfall. So all of a sudden you started to see not just health, you saw a health-led resurgence of our high streets, and you saw businesses suddenly almost taking on that campaigning mantle about actually there's a commercial element to this, but we've got to lean into it. And so what I think is really interesting, I was in SSL's UK Reef this week and talking about almost health at the heart of like a values-led regeneration. I can genuinely see that coming, John. And I think that, we need to come back to the principles of good work and make sure that a health-led regeneration is true to the health bit and is improving health. So that's just a thought about what might happen in the future, John.
No, that is really, I think that it's the partnership angle, isn't it? And it's the fact that everything's connected, and the fact that, the health and anchor institutions of any sort have something to add to businesses, but in return, is it unreasonable to expect them to provide good work to their employees? Any other examples of approaches to promoting good work that we haven't really touched on here?
I was just going to mention one thing in relation to, I suppose, sectors where kind of non-standard contracts are more common. And I suppose it's that balance between, we are a 24-hour society in some respects. And, for some people, I think it's to kind of acknowledge the diversity and what people need from work. So for some people, non-standard contracts might offer more flexibility, whereas some people that represents really severe insecurity. So thinking about, but there was just one thing that I wanted to mention from the Living Wage Foundation. There's the living hours standard as well as the living wage standard. So thinking about, acknowledging the need for flexibility and antisocial for some people working hours. What kind of is the minimum requirement people need in order to feel secure in their number of hours they're going to work per month, so they can, plan income-wise. Acknowledging that there may need to be some flexibility, and some flexibility may be desired by the contractee. So just another example of another approach.
John, can I just build on something Alice said? Made me think about the 24-hour nature of the NHS workforce. And I've been talking to our ambulance colleagues about the offering for the staff during the night time, which could be food or place to stay. That many of the options are not there, are they? For compared to what we, what we experience on more regular working hours. So, but of course, the NHS cannot solve many of those things. So actually, it comes back to that broad nature, doesn't it, of developing a place and having that lens and having a thought. So actually, how can we take the experiences of our ambulance, our paramedics and our ambulance staff, and all the other staff that work irregular hours, and put those together with someone like the GLA's nighttime economy team, and just how can we start experimenting? I don't think it wouldn't be right for me sat in my, my loft during the day to try and write down how on earth we're supporting that. I don't know the experiences they have. So there's something about the broad nature of taking those experiences from the people, going working patterns, and then understanding the different parts of who has responsibility. And it's an interconnected world, isn't it? And we just need to reach out across the public sector actually and say, what can we do and who does it?
Yeah, and it's a reminder that good work isn't abstract, is it? And so that is a real thing. It makes real difference. And asking people, it's got to be based on people's experiences and what people want.
Just to draw attention, the GLA did do some work on the health experience of, you can find that on the GLA website. There's a question, it was a survey that was done for night workers and understanding their needs. It was a really interesting piece of work, which I can...
We'll send these links around to people after this, including the ones that Rosie and Michael have mentioned as well. Rosie, did you want to come in?
Well, I was just going to say that, you know, that linking up piece that Michael was just talking about, that is kind of happening, particularly at strategic authority level. So somewhere like South Yorkshire, who's, you know, like what I think was described as Britain's low pay capital, has kind of, you know, really started to build that into their kind of growth plans. They secure high paid jobs as part of their broader plan, like economic plan for good growth. They've got their growth hub for business support, so that's a kind of part of that. But also, like, really importantly, they're kind of working closely with their ICB, the Integrated Care Board, on economic inactivity specifically, and then kind of, you know, identifying ways of supporting people into public sector, like retaining people who develop health conditions, like how do we keep those people in employment. So it's that cross sector piece, and where kind of strategic level can work with local authorities, can work, you know, with integrated care boards. I think there needs to be kind of a joining up across the piece, really, on that sort of thing, and that is happening in some places at least.
Yeah, and it'd be interesting to see in South Yorkshire, because I know they've got a number of the government programmes. They've got the Pathways to Work stuff that was done in Barnsley, and they've got the coincident or the coterminosity of their strategic authority and the
which is really helpful.
And the accelerator, the health and, you know, the NHS growth, the health and growth accelerators too. I think all of these, we need to keep pulling together the lessons, don't we, from all of these different programs. We've got the Get Britain working plans coming out. I would really expect and hope to see, I mean, the guidance explicitly spoke about ICBs. I mean, this is something that interests me, you know, from a health hat on. I'm not sure if the government a few years ago had issued, you know, a request for a strategy looking at economic inactivity. I'm not sure that explicit parts of the health service will be named as core partners for this, but they are now. And I think that shows how far we've come. And hopefully that join up that Rose has spoken about continues, and we start to see strategies that don't just look connected, they feel connected on the ground.
Yeah, and I think good work, good health, better productivity, an inclusive economy, you know, that's what we all want, isn't it? I'm conscious of the time, so could I go round to each of the three of you and just ask you for your sort of final thought? Like, what one thing on promoting good work do you think colleagues should take from this webinar? Perhaps you first, Alice.
Well, it's hard to think of one thing. I think probably this kind of principle of co-design. So I think, and it's that thing of, I think everyone's bought into the case for good work. I think no one needs convincing that even if no employer wants to be offering bad quality work, but there's just so many other competing priorities. And I suppose acknowledging those is the best way of building solutions. So working in really close collaboration on good work initiatives with employers.
Yeah. Rosie?
I'm going to say, I think the thing is, you know, keep different levels of people to keep talking to each other, for, you know, strategic local authorities, NHS, that all businesses, all to just keep finding those forums for engagement and talking to each other, because I think this really is a kind of, it's an across the piece systematic issue, and national government as well needs to be part of those conversations.
And Michael?
Yeah, I think there's something about taking both a person approach, which we'll hear a lot about, but taking more than that, taking a civic approach. You know, how many different policy areas could we quite easily, you know, step into from this discussion, and how many of our local partners could we bring with us? So I think the more, and I'm having this conversation with the NHS, the more we can think through a civic lens, that the less you start, you know, the less you remain in your little sector box, and the more you start thinking about, you know, the people in the populations and communities. So I think person approach, but also civic approach, and I think that's really interesting.
I think that's a good note to finish on. And Michael's challenge to take a civic approach, and I think linking everything up and just recognizing that good work is so important because work is such a big part of our lives, and it's a big part of our experiences, and it affects families, it affects our health, and it affects in the end, we want an inclusive economy that we can all benefit from. So I hope everyone's found that a helpful discussion. It's challenged you, it's given you something to think about. Our advice is here and experience is here to use, and we'd be delighted to have further conversations. I'll circulate a copy of this webinar along with some of the links and resources that colleagues have spoken about today. And any questions, please do drop me a line. Also, watch this space for some more webinars on work, health and skills, which we'll be doing as part of the WorkWell programme. Finally, just to say a really big thank you to our speakers, to Rosie, Michael and Alice, for your wisdom and good humour and overall insight. So a big thank you. And to everybody for watching as well. Thanks very much. Enjoy the rest of your day and enjoy your bank holiday weekend when it comes.